So thank you, Laurel, for that kind introduction, and thank you to everybody for joining this talk under slightly unusual circumstances. It's a real honor to be delivering the Pathy lecture on the book arts. And so let me start with that term arts and how I'm understanding it for the purpose of the lecture. Cue my first illustration. And if we look at this slide, we're looking at two poems by the leading English poet between Milton and Wordsworth, Alexander Pope. On the left, the opening of his great mock epic poem, The Dunciad, beginning with his famous takeoff of Virgil's opening to the Aeneid, Arms and the Man I Sing, or in Pope, and the poem is in the first place a satire on the book trade, though it opens out into a much larger satire on cultural degeneration in general. Books and the Man I Sing, the first two brings the Smithfield Muses to the ears of kings. The Dunciad was first published in 1728, and this is one of the expanded editions of 1729. On the other side of the screen is one of Pope's last poems, 1740, which he left in manuscript fragments on his death in 1744. Someone had a go at publishing them in 1797, Joseph Warton, and that's what you see here. Book arts then. On one side of the page, a very elaborate and beautiful piece of fine printing with a bespoke ornamental headpiece, probably designed by William Kent, best known as a landscape architect. On the other, a rough and ready, but interestingly experimental attempt to catch on the page the peculiarities of Pope's unfinished manuscript, with its lacunae, its ellipses, and as they would be called at the time, hieroglyphs, various hieroglyphic marks. We can talk very fruitfully then about innovations in typographic design at the high point of the hand press era, before mechanized printing becomes the norm after about 1800. But we see here book arts in an additional sense. Pope is writing under conditions of censorship and at a time when publishers and printers often carried the can, as easier to prosecute, easier to convict than authors would be. The arts in play here are at the same time, crucially then, the arts of disguise. The beautiful design of the Dunciad is also a beautifully deniable political insult. It's a couplet, innocuous in itself about the ears of kings, below a headpiece, innocuous in itself, showing asses' ears, in a design that mimics royal arms, with actually the royal motto at the top. You may be able to see it, Nemo me impune lacessit, which brilliantly is the motto of the Order of the Thistle, the ass's favourite food. There are various other points in these opening pages to strengthen the mischievous hint, but already we can see what Pope is doing. He's implicating royalty in the satire of the poem. He's equating delicately kings with asses, but in a way that wouldn't stand up in court, or that would make prosecutors look ridiculous if they attempted to charge him. Even so, as Pope's career as an oppositional poet goes on, he's a Tory poet in an era of Whig hegemony under Prime Minister Walpole. He finds it harder and harder to communicate dissident meaning. He's too high profile himself to be prosecuted, but one of his circle of fellow poets was arrested and imprisoned in 1738, an event so alarming that, I quote a contemporary, the news struck Mr. Pope with such a panic and trembling in his nerves that he's not since been able to hold a pen. Pope's response was more or less to withdraw from political satire on the grounds that by now, he said, ridicule was become as unsafe as it was ineffectual. 1740 was left unfinished and unpublished, but Pope also used the poem to give a graphic demonstration of the state of being constrained in what he can say, of being gagged by state censorship. Eventually, the poem is published, again under conditions of censorship. This time in the 1790s, Prime Minister Pitt's crackdown on the press after the French Revolution. And Joseph Warton has his printer contrive the page in this very unusual way as a kind of visualization of the absence of free expression. It looks like a redacted document with controversial passages repeatedly blanked out by dashes, ellipses, and those hieroglyphs that you see especially in line 5. Again, then, we're looking at an experiment in the typographic arts, but we also witness an interesting exercise in the arts of literary disguise, of communicating dissident meaning. under conditions of censorship. In this lecture then, I'd like to address some of these issues by giving an overview of a book I recently completed entitled Poetics of the Pillory, English Literature and Seditious Libel from 1660 to 1820, though completed is probably not the word because more interesting material keeps coming up. It's a huge subject, and I'm now pursuing the topic with a more detailed study of the novelist Henry Fielding, who with Pope was one of the most important political satirists of the Walpole era. And I want to show you here some of my assistants from 2016. Well, I'm going to come back to the phase of the project that they particularly helped me with. This is a group I was able to work with intensively for 4 weeks in mid-2016, just about 4 years ago, under the auspices of the Jackman Humanities Scholars in Residence program, which was a wonderful opportunity for me, and I hope for them, and also for Northrop Frye, who you see here. He didn't do a great deal of work, but it was nice to have him there. The book then is about censorship and the effect of censorship on literary production, which has been a major topic in early modern studies, Renaissance studies, for a long time now, spearheaded first by Annabel Patterson of Yale University, previously of this university, whose influential book of 1984, Censorship and Interpretation, started a long debate which is still unfolding. So lots of activity in Renaissance studies, early modern studies, also in studies of Enlightenment France, 18th century France, where the key energizing figure has been Robert Darnton, the emeritus director, as he now is, of the Harvard University Library. But although one can point to tremendous scholarship of this kind on individual authors and genres and text in 18th century Britain, the topic just doesn't have the same centrality in the field as a whole. And that's above all because of the self-congratulatory myth of English liberty, this Whiggish myth of English liberty in the 18th century that dies very hard. Formal pre-publication censorship does indeed stop in England in 1695 when the restoration measure, usually known as the Licensing Act, sometimes the Printing Act, lapses, and for various reasons it's never renewed. You can publish anything you like after that. You don't have to get official permission. Your book doesn't have to be pre-approved and given imprimatur, let it be printed. But that doesn't mean you can't get prosecuted afterwards under the common law of seditious libel or blasphemous libel or obscene libel. So a central argument I make in the book is that censorship, broadly understood, in fact remains just as important in the 18th century as it was in the 17th. It's simply that it takes a different and in some respects more alarming because unpredictable form. I could quote numerous 18th century sources from Daniel Defoe at the beginning of this century to Jeremy Bentham at the end to make that point, that it's unpredictable and dangerous for that reason, this new regime. But really no one has put it better or with more concentrated menace than the dictator of Uganda in the 1970s, Idi Amin, who is alleged to have said to his people, you have freedom of speech. Freedom after speech, that I cannot guarantee. Partly then, I'm arguing a historical case about the ongoing importance of political press control right into the 19th century. But above all, the point of the book is to consider the consequences for poetry and other genres at a time when literature was emphatically political. People talk about writing poems on affairs of state in the 18th century, a term that might seem odd if you're an Elizabethan love sonneteer or if you're a romantic poet of nature. But politics is almost the default matter of poetry at this time. So how do you pursue this matter if you're a dissident or oppositional writer in a time of censorship? How do you communicate objectionable meaning in your verse or your prose without being prosecuted for it? What I'm doing in the book is look at the techniques, the arts that enabled poets, satirists, playwrights, novelists to navigate censorship while still communicating what they wanted to communicate, sometimes out of ideological commitment, but sometimes out of a simple sense, pragmatically, that seditious libel sold well. So the arts of disguise, ambiguity, indirection that enabled these writers to insinuate a meaning while also being able to disavow that meaning. to say, no, that might be how you're reading what I've written, but that's not what I meant at all. I meant something completely innocent. So in the book, I spend a lot of time with writers like Marvell, Dryden in the 17th century, late 17th century, Defoe, Pope, Fielding, and Johnson in the 18th, all the way to Southey and Shelley in the early 19th century, all writers of dissident satire at one point or another in their careers, all of whom got away with it more or less, Defoe being the big exception, and I'll come back to him. How did they do it? What were the arts they used? These are the main questions, but to answer these questions properly, I also needed a control group, writers who failed to exercise these arts of disguise effectively, writers who did get arrested, prosecuted, and punishment for seditious libel. That's what these guys were researching with me, and I'll come back to a couple of examples of that at the end of my talk. So my title, the title of the book, Poetics of the Pillory, poetics meaning the ways of writing, the codes and conventions, the literary arts I've just alluded to. But why the pillory? Well, across the swathe of time, I've lost a slide, but never mind. Right, across the swathe of time, covered in the book, a variety of offences, some of them no longer offences at all, could land you in this uncomfortable and quite dangerous position. The slide in front of you right now is someone in around 1680 who we're going to come back to. This is another example from 1756. In the pillory, that edifice which, says the legal historian John Beattie, another distinguished U of T scholar, might stand as a paradigm of the old penal order. The pillory was part of the theatricality of punishment in that old order, and so familiar in urban life that it attracted many colourful slang terms. You could, as these characters are doing, peep through the nutcrackers, or nab the stoop. You could become a surveyor of the highway or an overseer of the pavement. I like that one, an overseer of the pavement, for several kinds of fraud, including forgery or counterfeiting, peculation, selling adulterated goods, or short measure. Here is the disgraced MP and corn factor, Christopher Atkinson, outside the Corn Exchange in 1785, having swindled the Navy Victualling Board with flour dressed up as corn. And pillory, of course, can be moved anywhere, so you're always pilloried in the most humiliating place for you, outside the Corn Exchange in this particular case. And here's another slide of the same guy remonstrating with the crowd. Here is the lawyer Edward Aylett in New Palace Yard, where all his legal colleagues could see him in 1786. You could not be pilloried for gambling or being a fashion victim, though the cartoonist James Gilray in 1796 liked to imagine that you could. And indeed, the graphic satire of the 1790s involves numerous punitive fantasies of elite pillorying. Here is another one showing the politician Charles James Fox on the left and his sidekick Lord Hood on the right. Sometimes there's as I think there might be here, a sly suggestion of the guillotine about the representation of the pillory. You could certainly be pilloried for sexual offences, like brothel keeping or especially sodomy, and its offenders, or attempted sodomy, and its offenders in this category who ran the biggest risk of injury or death from mob violence. The violence is not really shown in this nasty satirical print of 1762, except in the menacing speech bubbles, though the man represented was in fact badly beaten. Not killed, as the manuscript note at the bottom, very small writing on the print says, but others were indeed killed in these circumstances, others convicted of sodomy or attempted sodomy. It was one such event that prompted a celebrated speech by the great Eben Burke in Parliament in 1780, calling on Parliament to end pillorying, though in that, as so often, Burke was ahead of his time by about 50 years. I might just add at this point that pillorying in British North America, as well as the United States, went on much longer. There is, believe it or not, an episode in Delaware at the very beginning of the 20th century. Here, just to give us a little bit of Canadian content is a wonderful drawing I found in the Confederation Centre Art Gallery in PEI, showing the Charlottetown pillory, probably in about in the later 1870s, thought to be 1876, this drawing. And if you look at the little girl in her bonnet looking up at the pillory, I'm pretty sure that's Anne of Green Gables. Most famously, the pillory was a tool for the censorship of print. It was, as the novelist Daniel Defoe put it in 1703, and here is Defoe, that hieroglyphic state machine contrived to punish fancy in. He stood in the pillory himself 3 times, 3 consecutive days in different places in 1703 because, as I mentioned just earlier, he's the one really major writer of the period to have been prosecuted, convicted and punished for seditious libel, the work in question being an ironic mock sermon called The Shortest Way with the Dissenters, written long before Defoe became a novelist with Robinson Crusoe nearly 20 years later. I'm just going to show you a couple of other images. This one was recently discovered by a research student in England. It's in the British Museum. It's a pack of cards. You could buy packs of topically themed political playing cards in this period. And this is a Tory pack of playing cards gloating about various Whigs who were prosecuted for seditious libel, had been in the last few years before 1705, which is roughly the date of the playing card pack. There are actually, in this sequence of hearts, 3 seditious libelers, William Fuller, John Tutchin, and then Defoe, shown in his lavish trademark full-bottom wig, being pilloried, the author of The Shortest Way with the Dissenters. In the pillory, there are things in the British Museum that have, still being discovered, which is rather wonderful. But Defoe is only the most famous of many seditious libel offenders to have undergone this punishment. We're looking here at, on the closest to me, a slide from again, this is about 1680, shortly afterwards, of a very obscure printer named John Colliford, who had printed a sequel to satire by Andrew Marvell. Interesting thing to notice on this card is the burning book at his feet. This is another, kind of embellishment of pillorying. That very often the offending book would be burnt in front of you. There's one famous case, a writer named William Prynne in 1632, whose book was so voluminous, about 1,000 pages, that he almost suffocated in the smoke. Alongside Colliford here is another Whig extremist, Nathaniel Redding. We saw him a little earlier. There are multiple versions of his disgrace. And he is a lawyer and perjurer. I'm not saying those are the same things, but he's a lawyer who committed perjury. Don't misunderstand me, please. And you could buy him not only on a playing card, but delightfully, this lovely range of ceramic ware. This is a ceramic tile. That would be just such a nice thing to put your morning coffee pot on. So, between 1660 and, of course, earlier, and the last book trade pillorying in 1812, numerous authors, printers, and publishers stood in the pillory for obscene libel, blasphemous libel, and especially my main subject, seditious libel. But actually, all these categories of libel bleed into one. Very often, when there's a political motivation, a writer or a publisher like Edmund Curll in 1728, Daniel Isaac Eaton in 1812, they'd be got on a proxy charge. They'd be done for blasphemous libel or obscene libel, because it's easier to make that charge stick. You're less likely to get a jury pushing back. So, go back to that phrase of Defoe, hieroglyphic state machine, he says. Hieroglyphic state machine, but not an entirely indecipherable one. The offences that I've just listed are wide in range and they might seem unconnected. Yet it's not wholly fanciful to find a common thread running through all the, as it were, pilloryable offences. Forgery, perjury, sodomy, seditious libel. They're all crimes against, they're all violations or perversions of officially sanctioned norms of what is natural or true. Offenders in all these categories do more than simply steal or commit violence like common criminals. Their false words or unnatural acts are more threatening than this. They challenge and destabilize basic conventions and assumptions that bind society. And the seditious libeller does this most eloquently of all. The more practical consideration for the authorities is that all these offences are ones expected to elicit special derision, most aptly punished then by humiliating public exposure as an object of shame. For the Restoration licensor and surveyor of the press, Roger Lestrange, the pillory was a penalty of disgrace above all. It was the right one for authors and stationers, he says, printers, publishers, who had rather suffer any other punishment than be made publicly ridiculous. For the philosopher and economist Adam Smith in 1759, this quintessential book trade punishment was actually worse than execution. The judge, Smith says, who orders a criminal to be set in the pillory dishonours him more than if he had condemned him to the scaffold. The pilloried malefactor was shamed forever by his, or occasionally her, exhibition to his scornful peers, or that was the theory. So there are two celebrated episodes of book trade pillorying that bookend the period I'm dealing with. The first is the ordeal suffered by William Prynne, whom I've just mentioned, and two fellow Puritan activists, Bastwick and Burton, after their conviction in 1637 by Archbishop Laud's Star Chamber, at a time when pillories served not only to frame and shame the malefactor, but also to immobilise him for officially inflicted mutilation. Prynne's ears, lightly cropped on a previous occasion, the history of mastics occasion that I mentioned, were this time nailed to the pillory and severed. His nostrils were slit, his face was branded with the initials SL for seditious or schismatic libeller, though Prynne himself embraced the letters as a sign of martyrdom. Stigmata laudis, he called them, Laud's stamps. This was in fact not the most excruciating pillorying of the mid-17th century. This is probably the prime candidate, a Quaker blasphemer named James Naylor. Prynne escaped the full penalty inflicted on Naylor, whose tongue was bored through with a red-hot iron under Cromwell in 1656 in pure lex talionis style, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Even so, Prynne's was probably the most notorious instance, and it's the one that is most talked about in scholarship now. At the other end of the period is an event no less well known to Romantic-era scholars, the pillorying in 1812 of Daniel Isaac Eaton, a radical publisher who escaped several attempts to get him in the 1790s, but was at last convicted for Tom Paine's The Age of Reason, Part 3. So he's successfully convicted in the end for blasphemous libel, having escaped seditious libel. No question now of state-inflicted mutilation, and the only physical danger was from mob violence. But that failed to happen. A crowd of 20,000 turned out to cheer Eaton on, and the event became a riotous festival of popular disaffection. But not from public attachment to deism, Cobbett adds. It was their attachment to the liberty of the press, and William Cobbett gives one of the fullest reports that we have of this event. It was their attachment to the liberty of the press. We have detailed prose accounts, not only from Cobbett, but from others, of Eaton's pillorying. We don't have an image. However, I can show you just a couple of slides that indicate how things are changing in the Romantic era. This one is from the 1790s. This is a handbill. Amazing that something like this survives. This is a handbill that was passed around in London on the day when John Frost, a radical, was to stand in the pillory at Charing Cross for supporting the rights of the people, exclamation mark. The handbill says. So this was handed around to drum up support for Frost. And as these handbills were being handed out in the morning, the authorities panicked and called off the pillorying. They were so worried that there would be a riot. And they called it off allegedly because of Frost's ill health, though he then miraculously lived for another 40-odd years. And then there's probably the best slide. This is actually in Dublin. I think that we're outside Temple Bar in Dublin, where Walter Cox, Watty Cox, publisher and editor in practice of the Irish Magazine in 1810, is being pilloried for a seditious allegory Republican allegory, in effect called the Painter Cut. And you can see again, just how counterproductive this event is. The crowd have turned out to support him, not to humiliate him. And he's standing there, enjoying the occasion. If anyone looks humiliated, it's the officer, supervising the event. So this, if you like, is a rather exact Dublin equivalent of the Eton pillory in London 2 years later, 1812. So on the face of it, these are very different episodes. They're almost 2 centuries apart, Prynne, Eton. The spectacular punishment inflicted on Prynne in Palace Yard contrasts with quite a heartening hour for Eton outside Newgate Jail. A merciless demonstration of state power in the heyday of Star Chamber repression contrasts with a striking dramatisation of official impotence before 19th century public opinion. But there are common aspects, and already in Prynne's martyrdom, as he adroitly represented it, we can foresee the pillory's demise in legislation passed after Eton's triumph in the 18-teens. Prynne was an insightful analyst of Laudian strategies of intimidation. He and his companions, he says, were to be deprived of their ears to the public terror of all others, he later wrote. And he realised that exemplary punishment could be turned around as a spectacle of exemplary resistance. Popular sympathy was just as much a factor, in fact, in Prynne's case as it was in Eton, as was the boost given to the episode to the dissident speech and writing that it was supposed to suppress. In the Romantic period, the Jacobin seditious libeller turned Tory poet laureate Robert Southey noted with amazement in his commonplace book, and he's actually quoting Archbishop Laud here, that Prynne and his fellows should be suffered to talk what they pleased while they stood in the pillory, and win acclamations from the people, and have notes taken of what they spake, and those notes spread in written copies about the city, and that when they went out of town to the several imprisonments, there were thousands suffered, again aloud, there were thousands suffered to be upon their way to take their leave. In his eyewitness history of the civil wars, the Earl of Clarendon remembered this triumphant procession into internal exile as a contributory factor along the road to civil war. For outraged spectators, who Clarendon wrote, treasured up wrath for the time to come. Already, censorship and the pillory were looking counterproductive, own goals that awakened, not silenced, dissident opinion, and destabilised, not secured, Stuart authority. Prynne's own judgment was that he and his fellow sufferers had lost their ears so that people in general, he said, might hear better. So it would be relatively easy for this book to tell a story about emergent press freedom that already has its germ in the case of Prynne. Between the two legislative landmarks that bookend the period, the Licensing Act, 1662, the 1819 Seditious Libels Act, political press control became harder to exert. Restoration England never achieved the monolithic state apparatus constructed in France under Louis XIV, and despite the formidable energies of individual regulators, censorship was typically a ramshackle affair. It was brutal and effective in particular cases, but it was a leaky sieve in general. There was no wholly unified state power, and as early as the exclusion crisis of the 1680s, competing authorities, in this case the Tory court, the Whig city, could and did frustrate one another's efforts to convict and punish book trade professionals. Just how hard it is to talk of an all-efficient, single-minded state is most graphically seen in the case of the poet, philologist and lawyer William Jones in 1783. His pamphlet, The Principles of Government, was prosecuted by one branch of government as, quote, a seditious, treasonable and diabolical tract. Diabolical. Even as its author, Jones himself, was being knighted and appointed a Supreme Court judge in Bengal by another branch. Moreover, the High Sheriff who launched the prosecution was actually the brother of the Prime Minister who engineered the knighthood. So there are all kinds of strange dynamics going on within officialdom in this period. Jürgen Habermas may or may not be right that we're now entering a world regulated as much by public opinion as by state authority, but it was clearly the perception of ministers and officials, impressed on them by frequent setbacks, that juries could not be counted on to give the right verdict, spectators could not be counted on to show the right hostility. Other factors certainly contributed to a weakening of press control, from the self-perception of the 18th century as polite and enlightened. Shaftesbury and Hume are important voices here, to the commercial energies of a book trade in which seditious libels were hot commodities, and as Samuel Johnson memorably observed, to prosecute a book was also to promote it. In so, these trends towards press freedom are not the whole story, and given the powerful forces I've just mentioned, we might ask about the decline and fall of literary censorship, and in particular the decline and fall of the pillory as a sanction against seditious libel. The question that Gibbon famously asks about the Roman Empire, not why did it end, but why did it last so long? Because last it did in powerful and pervasive ways that we still underestimate. Despite interesting studies, particular authors, particular episodes of the intervening period, there persists an assumption that the collapse of pre-publication licensing in 1695 marks the end to political censorship as a major factor for literature, except during periods of special crisis like the French Revolution in the 1790s. It's an old assumption, fully formed in the Whig history of the 19th century, as when Thomas Macaulay declared in 1835 that press emancipation after the Glorious Revolution, specifically the lapse of the Licensing Act, released England from what Macaulay calls the great practical evil of Tudor and Stuart censorship. And just briefly, we might illustrate that view by looking at the very different way in which Defoe starts to get represented in the Victorian period. The early images, the very early printed images from the early 1700s that I showed you, really designed to show his humiliation. Here, he's a free speech martyr. He's almost Christ-like. In fact, I mean, you can read this painting as a kind of Calvary. We've even got the two thieves in the niches of the architectural detail of London's Temple Bar right behind him. It's hard not to see that drink that he's being offered. No, it's a nosegay of flowers that he's being offered. It's hard not to see it as something like the sponge bearer episode in biblical narratives of the crucifixion. So we've moved really utterly into a kind of new way of thinking about seditious libelers in the 18th century, who now become signs, kind of landmarks along the way towards this emergent press freedom of the 18th century that historians like Macaulay are celebrating. This Whiggish narrative of emergent press freedom persists in the face of a lot of efforts that were actually being made right through the 18th century. First of all, to restore pre-publication censorship. Some of them were failures, some were rather successful. There's a major new licensing act in 1737 targeted specifically at the theatre, and a number of other pieces of legislation that I could talk about. But most important is the shift of emphasis after 1695 from pre-publication permission to post-publication retribution, without any sense on the part of book trade professionals that this new regime, based not on the old Licensing Act, but on the common law of seditious libel, provided greater latitude for safe expression. On the contrary, the wave of prosecutions in which Defoe was caught suggests less latitude. And though we may already hear in Archbishop Laud's PR misstep with William Prynne in the 1630s the death knell of state censorship in a new, uncontrollable world of public opinion, the same struggle keeps on playing out after the restoration of the monarchy in 1660 for a century and a half. Defoe's 3 Days in the Pillory in 1703, the printer Edmund Curll in 1728, the novelist John Shibir in 1758, a printer of Wilkes's North Britain in 1763, all the way through several 1790s cases to Eaton's pillorying for printing Tom Paine in 1812. A long view in which censorship now looks to have been in terminal decline was not an available perspective at the time. And though nobody was going to suffer physically in the way that Prynne did, that didn't mean no suffering at all. When Jonathan Swift, told Pope that he'd only be able to publish Gulliver's Travels in 1726 when, I quote Swift, "a printer shall be found brave enough to venture his ears," he used a playful figure of speech alluding to the old punishment of ear cropping. But it remains the case that arrest and prosecution, if not actual mutilation, were real hazards for Swift's printers and publishers. By the time Swift makes this jovial remark, at least 2 of his printers had already spent time in prison on Swift's account. Partly then, I'm arguing a historical case about the persistence and residual power of censorship, even while we observe it as on the wane. No less important is the literary case for our slowness to place censorship at the centre of our understanding of Enlightenment literature is not just a historical blind spot. To underestimate its ongoing power in post-licensing print culture is also to miss a crucial determinant of 18th century authorship and a condition to which the complexities and energies of the period's writing are often owing. This is the great age of irony in literature, and irony is one of a number of forms of ambiguity richly present in the writing of the period that hand over to readers the burden of completing meanings that might be suggested or implied by authors without being fully articulated in print. In other words, we may read ambiguity or indeterminacy in 18th century literature not simply as a matter of authorial play or a consequence of the textual condition or the inherent properties of language, but as a conscious and potentially very powerful strategy for circumventing censorship. If so, it follows that we may think of censorship as not only an instrument of control, but also as an enabling discipline in creative terms. While regulating what could be said and how, it could stimulate ingenious strategies of evasion of many kinds. From the strictly literary arts of ambiguity, functional ambiguity employed by authors, to the clandestine presses and decoy imprints, sometimes employed by the printers and publishers with whom they worked. Book arts, then, and arts of disguise at one and the same time. In the book, then, this framing argument prepares the way for contextualized close readings of major writers from the late 17th century to the early 19th century, but I also needed my control group. And these were less skillful, less vigilant, less well-connected writers who couldn't or wouldn't practice the arts of disguise well enough to avoid prosecution. One of the best places to find them is in the very early 18th century, a fraught period for particular reasons, the reign of Queen Anne from 1702 to 1714. And the effects of the crackdown that happened during the reign of Queen Anne are usefully described just in this passage by the novelist and historian Tobias Smollett. Writing about 50 years later, he talks about the kind of crisis in this period where he says, as many severe and sarcastic writings had lately appeared in which the Whigs and ministry were reviled and reflections hinted to the prejudice of the Queen's person, the government resolved to make examples of the authors and publishers of these licentious productions, and then he lists some of them. Dr. Joseph Brown was twice pilloried for a copy of verses entitled The Country Parson's Advice to the Lord Keeper, and a letter which he afterwards wrote to Mr. Secretary Harley. William Stevens, rector of Sutton in Surrey, underwent the same sentence as author of a pamphlet called A Letter to the Author of the Memorial of the Church of England. Edward Ward was fined and set in the pillory for having written a burlesque poem on the Times under the title Hudibras Redivivus, and the same punishment was inflicted upon William Pittis, author of a performance entitled The Case of the Church of England's Memorial, fairly stated, a particularly controversial text at the time that was also the subject of prosecution. Even more hazardous than these years was the immediate aftermath of Queen Anne's death, the Hanoverian accession of 1714, and the Jacobite rising against this Whig Hanoverian settlement in 17. So let me close by quickly showing you 2 good examples of seditious poems from these years. And again, I'm coming back to my my happy team of researchers from 4 years ago, where I gave each of these students, each of these brilliant students, one of the seditious libelers that I've just mentioned in that Smollett pamphlet to research, because these obscure figures are really very under-researched. They found immense amount of very interesting new material, researching online using online access to 18th century newspapers, State Papers online, 18th Century Collections online, lots of wonderful digital resources, as well as the resources that, of course, we are able to use here when we're not locked down. My two examples: authors who failed to defend themselves adequately against the threat of official action and whose authors were convicted and punished. Here's one of the works mentioned by Smollett. Joseph Brown's 1706 poem's a bit of a stretch, let's say, versus the country parson's honest advice. Very interesting case in setting a legal precedent for the successful prosecution of ironic discourse, even when the literal surface meaning might seem innocent. Brown's case established that, this is 76, that irony was libelous if the court so interpreted it, or if the defendant failed to refute the charge of underlying ill intent. I won't read the poem, but you can see what's happening. I hope you can see what's happening. Brown, a Tory extremist with Jacobite leanings, is affecting to praise numerous Whig ministers and grandees in terms that in fact implicitly blame them. It's a rudimentary exercise then in ironic epideixis, or really plain vanilla sarcasm, that congratulates the ministers in question for exactly the virtue that each was most notorious for not having. So, towards the end, double-dealing Godolphin is singled out for probity, promiscuous Devonshire is singled out for chastity, arrogant Halifax is singled out for modesty. And at trial, Brown rested his defence. He really did seem to think he could get away with it. He rested his defence on the poem's patently untenable surface meaning, and after conviction he dug himself in deeper with a pamphlet that he says upheld the natural and genuine sense of the poem, not the harsher meaning alleged by the court. Now, in this follow-up pamphlet, Brown tests each compliment to breaking point. If any doubt were to be cast on Devonshire's chastity, surely his grace had too much good nature or good sense to ask the reason. And then how could anybody doubt Godolphin's probity when his lordship controlled such enormous sums of public money? Inevitably, though he failed to see the inevitability himself, Brown received a fresh sentence to the pillory for compounding his offence. Defoe loves this. Defoe, his enemy. Defoe gloats that Brown has been pilloried for writing ironies and then expounding them ironically. The episode, in effect, criminalises subtextual meaning, and in the original trial, Lord Chief Justice Holt was careful to spell out the precedent being set. The manner of speaking was to be noted, the manner of speaking, and information will lie for speaking ironically. The case then helps to measure the limits of acceptable discourse at this delicate historical juncture. Brown made rudimentary gestures of ambiguity, but what he took for protective irony was blatant sarcasm, and his strategy backfired. In the wording of the official King's Bench record, he was fined and pilloried for a scandalous and malicious libel in verses on the Lord Keeper Cooper and several other lords, and then for compounding the offence in another scandalous and seditious libel, which ventured foolhardy glosses on the original poem. Here's the kind of thing that my students were able to get electronic access to. This is in the National Archives in Kew in London, and this is from State Papers. This is Secretary of State Harley, one of the heroes of The Favourite, if you've seen that movie. Secretary of State Harley, played by Nicholas Hoult, committing Brown to Newgate, he being charged upon oath to be the author of a scandalous and seditious libel entitled The Country Parson's Honest Advice. I'll end then with, I think, my favourite example, Nero II, 1715, of which this oddly shaped Bodleian broadside, it's a single long galley which I've cropped into two for this slide, appears to be the only surviving print copy. There are a couple of manuscript copies as well, but this is the only surviving print copy. And it's a really beautiful illustration of all the moves you shouldn't make. And in the book, I use it as a foil for reading the immeasurably defter insinuations of Alexander Pope. First and most simply, there's the choice of target. Several poets, playwrights, and journalists discovered in the early Hanoverian era to move from mocking a ministry and attacking its policies to mocking royalty and questioning its legitimacy was to cross a red line. The danger becomes more acute when wit gives way to invective. And with startling incaution, This poem, Nero II, uses a recent urban conflagration, the Thames Street Fire of 1715, to develop an undisguised parallel between Nero and King George I. Both are tyrants who laugh as their capital burns. They both oppress their subjects with illegal edicts. They both crucially lack inherited legitimacy. Nero possessed, this is on the first column, Nero possessed Britannicus' crown. George has usurped our royal James's throne. Nero II also demonstrates another fail-safe route to arrest, which was to shift out of the indicative and into the imperative mood. O freeborn Britons, this is the bottom of the very end of the poem. O freeborn Britons, since a tyrant reigns, assert your liberties, shake off your chains, let us in justice rival ancient Rome, let Nero's vices meet with Nero's doom, and speedily call King James from exile home. These incendiary verses got about. They came to notice, probably weren't sold, probably just given away, but they came to notice on being reprinted in the West Country by a man named Philip Bishop, proprietor of the Exeter Mercury, and he was, an information was filed against him, quoting those last lines about usurping thrones and shaking off chains. Bishop died in prison after being convicted. A copy found its way to Dublin, where a young Jacobite printer named Edward Bingley was convicted for uttering treasonable words. The Prince of Orange and Princess Anne were usurpers, and publishing a seditious libel. Nero II, he was pilloried for the latter offence. Eventually they found the author, sometimes rather difficult to do. Turns out to be a former mayor of Leeds named William Cookson. Cookson spent the winter in Newgate and was lucky to return to normal life the following year after intercessions from influential contacts. This poem was, of course, the work of and then most copies were destroyed. We had just have this accidental survival. This poem was, of course, the work of a bungling amateur, a consideration that in the end may have saved Cookson. No professional or otherwise experienced author would have violated the conventions of disguise so blatantly, or if tempted to do so, such an author would have struck to manuscript circulation, like the young Jacobite poet Richard Savage in his poems at exactly the same juncture around 1715. Print was a much more serious matter than mere manuscript circulation, and we have here, surviving really just by chance in this single printed copy, a howlingly egregious instance of the kind of poem you really must not write, and you certainly must not put into print in 18th century England. It's a catastrophic failure in that essential book trade art of the period, the art of disguise. So thank you very much. I've closed here. Thank you very much for tuning in, that's not exactly the word, for attending this talk. And we're going to move now, I hope, to a real question session following it. Thank you.